Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the long, slow twilight of an empire that once believed it would last forever. So get comfortable, dim the lights, maybe take a deep breath, and settle into that wonderfully quiet moment before sleep. Because tonight, we're wandering into the story of how something small, sticky, and surprisingly portable helped unravel one of the most powerful civilizations the world had ever seen. We're exploring how opium, yes, that tiny brown lump that smelled faintly like despair, slowly and gently dismantled the Qing Empire, one pipe, one pouch, and one very confused official at a time. And naturally, as with most imperial disasters, it all begins with people in charge assuming they were far too important to ever face consequences. A classic choice. So let's ease ourselves into early Qing China, drifting softly across the vast landscape of the 17th and 18th centuries, an era when emperors still believed the universe rotated politely around them, because of course it did. The dynasty was new, energetic, and just self-confident enough to think, yes, this will go perfectly. What could possibly go wrong? And as history usually responds, everything, literally everything. But for now, in this early moment, the world was quiet. The Kangxi Emperor, and later the Yongzheng and Qianlong emperors, enjoyed lives cushioned by tens of thousands of servants, endless ceremonies, and the comforting belief that nothing inconvenient would ever disturb their schedule. The forbidden city glowed with red walls and golden roofs, shimmering with imperial certainty, the kind that often precedes disaster. If you imagine an empire humming gently, confidently, like a man who has no idea he's walking toward an open manhole, that's Qing China at its peak. The population was growing rapidly. Agricultural innovations were spreading. The treasury was comfortable, not overflowing, but respectable, like a polite middle-class savings account. And foreign trade, though tightly restricted, still trickled in through Canton, where European merchants waited patiently, occasionally sweating through their wigs, trying to convince officials that maybe, just for fun, China could allow a little more trade. China's response was roughly equivalent to a bored shrug. After all, why would the empire want anything Europe had? Europe was cold, noisy, and full of men who wore too much perfume. And besides, China already had tea, silk, porcelain, basically the holy trinity of global desirability. Europeans crave these things with a passion normally reserved for lovers or elaborate pastries. China, on the other hand, mainly wanted silver. Not inventions, not ideas, not mechanical contraptions that broke after 2 days, just silver. Everything else Europeans tried to offer was politely, or not so politely, declined. A bit like receiving yet another pair of socks for your birthday. Appreciated, but unnecessary. So silver flowed into China like a glittering river, enriching merchants and filling storehouses, all while China's elite floated serenely, confident that this arrangement would continue indefinitely, which naturally it did not. But before the smoke drifted in, let's linger a moment in this golden age, when emperors still believed themselves chosen by heaven, and officials still believed that writing increasingly long memos would solve every problem ever. You can almost imagine them dipping their brushes in ink, taking a deep breath, and beginning each report with the same quiet optimism. Something like, "Your Majesty, a small matter has arisen," and in fairness, many of those small matters were indeed handled, or at least buried effectively enough that no one remembered them. The Qianlong Emperor, perhaps the most confident man in Asia at the time, famously told British envoy Lord Macartney that China needed nothing from Europe, not a single thing. It was a bold statement, the kind you'd only say if you were extremely sure of yourself or extremely out of touch. He might as well have said, "We already have everything we will ever need." History heard him, raise an eyebrow, and whispered, "All right, if you insist." So let's drift lightly through these decades. The fields stretching across the countryside, the smooth hum of canal boats slipping across peaceful water, the slow creak of the Grand Canal's locks, villages waking to morning mist, and in the distance, the glow of Beijing, the beating heart of a world that believed itself eternal. It's a pleasant scene to fall asleep to. Calm, predictable, stable, but stability has a way of masking fragility, especially when that stability depends on rigid thinking, selective hearing, and officials who panic when confronted with anything unfamiliar. And Europe was getting very unfamiliar very fast. While China was lounging in its golden age, the West was busy inventing machines, ships, guns, banks, stock markets, and a peculiar economic delusion known as we must sell more things than we buy, or the world will collapse. This mercantilist anxiety made European powers do all sorts of strange things, like trying to trade with a country that absolutely did not want anything from them. Portugal tried. Holland tried. France gave it a shot. And Britain was a kid on the playground who did not know how to take no for an answer. British merchants stared at China with longing, the way a child stares at a locked bakery window full of pastries. China sparkled with goods that Europeans wanted desperately, and in return, Britain had wool and clocks and cheap trinkets that Chinese merchants inspected politely, nodded, and then proceeded to ignore completely.
And so British warehouses groaned under the weight of unsellable goods while British tea drinkers consumed so much Chinese tea that the national bloodstream was essentially 38% caffeine. Something had to give. And Britain, being Britain, solved the problem with exactly the level of grace and morality you'd expect. They found something addictive, smuggled it in, and waited patiently for society to collapse. But we're not there quite yet. Let's stay a bit longer in the calm before the storm, drifting between palace corridors and tea houses, imagining a world where the most pressing issues involved minor tax disputes and imperial poetry contests. The emperors held grand hunts in the northern plains, galloping across crisp grasslands, firing arrows at targets while pretending to relive the glory of their nomadic ancestors. Court painters immortalized these scenes with brushwork so delicate that you could almost hear the faint breathing of the horses. In Beijing, mandarins in flowing robes debated the meaning of Confucian phrases with the seriousness of people who sincerely believed that a misinterpreted proverb could bring down civilization. To be fair, they had seen it happen before. And out in the coastal cities, merchants whispered about foreign ships, odd languages, and strange goods that floated in and out of the harbors, curiosities, nothing more. Little disturbances on the horizon. The truth was that China didn't know it was vulnerable. And perhaps even more important, it didn't know that Europe had stopped asking for permission. Britain, in its quest to rebalance the tea-silver trade, had discovered something in India. Something profitable. Something dangerously enjoyable. Something light enough to smuggle. Something that people got addicted to with surprising enthusiasm. Opium. It had been used in China before, of course. Mostly as medicine. Mostly harmless. The kind of thing your elderly neighbor might brew into a tea when their joints ached. But foreigners had a way of turning mild substances into global problems, a skill they apparently perfected during the age of exploration. The British East India Company looked at India's opium fields the way a merchant looks at a stack of gold coins. And they looked at China's addiction-free, silver-rich population the way a gambler looks at a table full of easy marks. Meanwhile, back in Beijing, the emperor continued writing poetry, blissfully unaware that across the sea, a giant global corporation was preparing to drug his empire for profit. History is rarely kind. But it's almost always ironic. So as the century turned, and as Europe industrialized, and as Britain realized just how expensive its tea habit had become, the stage was set. Not for a quick collapse, history prefers slow burns and long sighs, but for a gradual unwinding of power. Imagine the empire like a grand tapestry. Beautiful. Intricately woven. Seemingly unbreakable. And then imagine a small thread being tugged, again and again, until eventually, the whole thing begins to loosen. That thread was opium. And the tugging, as we'll soon drift into, came from a mixture of greed, incompetence, overconfidence, and some truly questionable decision-making from people who definitely should have known better. Before we drift into those decisions, though, it's worth pausing here, at the end of part 1, in this moment of calm before the trouble begins. Think of it like the last quiet breath before a long sigh. And if you were living in Qing China at this moment, seeing foreign ships in the distance, hearing vague rumors about new goods, and watching officials reassure everyone that everything was absolutely fine, what would you have thought? Would you have sensed the coming storm? Or would you have trusted the calm? Let me know in the comments, if you're still awake. Let's drift onward, slowly, into the first tendrils of the smoke. Not yet the thick, choking haze of full addiction, but the early, whisper-soft phase, when people still thought opium was just a fun little evening treat. The kind of thing you'd try once, fully convinced you were too sophisticated, too virtuous, or too deeply committed to Confucian respectability to ever get addicted. A charming delusion shared by millions. You can almost imagine the first curious scholar officials sitting in their quiet study rooms, brushing off the smell with a polite wave. Perhaps they thought it would help them sleep. Or give them ideas for poetry. Or soothe the ache of dealing with bureaucratic paperwork that stretched on longer than the Great Wall. They certainly didn't imagine it would someday bring foreign gunboats to their shores. If they had, maybe they would have put the pipe down sooner. But people rarely look that far ahead, especially people who consider themselves stable, refined, and destined for long careers complaining about minor tax irregularities in provinces they've never visited. So the early 1700s came and went with opium quietly slipping into society like an overly friendly houseguest who insists they'll only stay a day or two. But as the years went on, that guest unpacked their luggage, took over the couch, and started asking if anyone had spare silver. Meanwhile, the British East India Company watched this process with a mixture of satisfaction and greed. The company had all the charm of a global corporation run by men who believed profit was a moral virtue. They controlled India, they controlled the opium fields, and now they wanted to control the Chinese market, ideally without the hassle of polite negotiation. Officially, Britain pretended to discourage opium sales to China. Unofficially, the East India Company handed out licenses to private traders with the enthusiasm of a store clerk handing out discounts on items that were accidentally overpriced. The cleverness of the system is mildly impressive, in a morally questionable way. The company grew opium in India. Private smugglers carried it to China. Chinese dealers moved it inland. And Beijing remained blissfully unaware for years because local officials preferred not to mention unpleasant things in their reports. After all, why inconvenience the emperor with such trivial matters as rising addiction rates and collapsing public health? It was easier to file these issues away under, "someone else will handle this," which is the unofficial motto of declining empires. And so the smoke drifted deeper. Somewhere along the coastline, beneath dim lamplight in a Canton warehouse, the first crates of Indian opium were traded quietly for silver. The smugglers were thrilled. The Chinese intermediaries were thrilled. The British merchants were absolutely euphoric. And the local officials, who were theoretically responsible for stopping this, were making so much money in bribes that they couldn't hear warnings over the jingling of their coin purses. Corruption is a bit like humidity, always present, rarely acknowledged, and quite capable of ruining everything before anyone notices. By the late 1700s, opium was spreading inland. Slowly at first. Then steadily. Then with uncomfortable enthusiasm. In teahouses, on boats, in market stalls, you could find someone who had a cousin who knew a supplier. Addicts were still relatively rare. Most people treated opium like a harmless distraction. A way to unwind after a long day of farming, fishing, or attempting to read imperial edicts written in incomprehensible layers of classical Chinese. But even then, a few people saw trouble coming. Confucian scholars muttered warnings under their breath. Military commanders noticed their soldiers becoming more relaxed than the job description recommended. Village elders noticed young men spending more time lounging than working. And a few particularly brave officials even wrote timid reports to the capital describing a modest concern regarding the increased use of foreign narcotics. Those reports, of course, were politely ignored. The emperor at the time, the Qianlong emperor, was still busy performing his favorite hobbies, being extremely confident, disliking Europeans, and commissioning expensive art to celebrate how much he disliked Europeans. He believed, with the serene certainty of someone who had never been contradicted in his life, that China was too stable to be threatened by something as small as a drug. A reasonable assumption, if history hadn't been quietly rolling up its sleeves preparing to prove him wrong. By the early 1800s, however, the problem could no longer be dismissed. Opium addiction was rising dramatically. The market wasn't just coastal anymore, it was everywhere. In the countryside, the cities, the army, even among lower-ranking officials. And if there's one thing that alarms a dynasty, it's discovering that the people responsible for enforcing the law are too relaxed to enforce anything at all. The Daoguang Emperor, who inherited the throne in 1820, found himself presiding over a mess he did not create and certainly did not want. He was a serious, anxious man, the type who probably organized his scrolls alphabetically and worried constantly about whether heaven approved of his hairline. The empire's decline weighed heavily on him, and opium felt like yet another insult from a world that refused to remain orderly. So he tried to intervene. He issued edicts. He issued more edicts. He wrote strongly worded instructions telling provincial officials to stop this foreign poison. And provincial officials nodded obediently, bowed respectfully, and then continued doing absolutely nothing because their side income depended on it. It's hard to stop a problem when everyone whose job it is to stop it is being paid not to. So the emperor tried another tactic, moral persuasion. He issued lectures. He appealed to Confucian values. He reminded everyone that addiction was unfilial, unhealthy, and deeply embarrassing for the empire. The response was mild interest followed by continued smoking. This pattern is familiar in many societies. People try something. They enjoy it. A leader tells them not to do it. They nod politely and continue doing it anyway. By this time, even military garrisons, supposedly the backbone of imperial defense, were affected. Drills slowed. Discipline softened. And commanders quietly panicked as they watched their troops become far too mellow for combat. You cannot fight a war when half your soldiers would rather lie down on a mat and philosophize. Meanwhile, British merchants grew wealthier than ever. They saw China's addiction problem not as a tragedy, but as a promising business opportunity. Each chests of opium sold brought in silvered, glorious, glittering, imperial tea purchasing silver which flowed back to British vaults like water returning to the sea. And Britain wanted more. More markets. More profit. More access. More ports. More leverage. Empires rarely practice moderation. As the 1830s approached, the Daoguang Emperor reached a breaking point. The treasury was bleeding silver. Farmers were collapsing under the weight of addiction. And the government's reputation was deteriorating in the eyes of its own subjects. Something had to be done. And for once, the court decided to act decisively. They appointed a strict, upright, famously incorruptible scholar official named Lin Zexu. Imagine the most serious, disciplined, morally unshakable person you've ever met, then remove all sense of humor. That was Lin Zexu. A man who saw the opium crisis not as a political inconvenience, but as a national emergency worthy of absolute, dramatic action. When he arrived in Canton, the local officials probably sighed, knowing instantly that the good times were over. Lin was the kind of man you could not bribe, distract, confuse, or flatter. He didn't care about money. He didn't care about comfort. He cared about duty, which made him a rarity in late Qing China and a direct threat to anyone hoping to continue smuggling narcotics. His plan was simple. And, perhaps inevitably, it made everything worse. Lin Zexu demanded that all opium in Canton be surrendered immediately. He ordered the blockade of foreign factories. He cut off supplies, surrounded the merchants, and then sent a message to Queen Victoria herself demanding she stop British opium exports altogether. It was a heartfelt letter. Very polite. Very well written. And never reached its intended recipient because British officials saw it, shrugged, and filed it away somewhere unimportant. After trembling foreign merchants finally surrendered their opium, Lin Zexu marched it all down to the water, poured lime on it, and destroyed it in front of everyone. 20,000 chests. Millions of dollars of merchandise. Gone. A bold choice. A morally righteous act. And the diplomatic equivalent of poking a sleeping bear repeatedly with a stick. Britain's response was predictable: outrage, indignation, and eventually, gunboats. But before the cannons start firing, which we will drift into next time, let's linger here for a moment, with Lin Zexu standing at the coastline, watching the drug that had poisoned his nation dissolve into the sea. He believed he had saved China. He believed he had done the honorable thing. And in many ways, he had. But history is complicated. And empires rarely appreciate moral victories when money is involved. As part 2 fades to a close, imagine yourself there on that coastline, watching the opium swirl into the water like ink spreading across a blank page. Would you have done what Lin Zexe did? Would you have destroyed it all? Or tried something else? Let me know in the comments if you haven't drifted off already. Let's drift gently into the next stretch of this quietly unraveling tale. The year is 1839, and the ocean is calm, at least on the surface. Beneath that stillness, though, something far less peaceful was stirring, the kind of thing that happens when one empire destroys millions of dollars worth of another empire's favorite drug. You can almost hear Britain clearing its throat across the ocean, preparing to express its displeasure in the universal language of imperial gunboats. Now, if you imagine a dramatic confrontation, try to tone it down a bit. This isn't a thunderous, cinematic moment. It's more like watching someone slow walk into a mistake they fully believe is a good idea. China felt morally justified. Britain felt commercially offended. And when morality collides with profit, profit usually hires a navy. Back in London, politicians reacted to Lin Zexe's destruction of opium with the offended elegance of people who were extremely used to getting their way. They called it unlawful. They called it outrageous. Someone probably called it simply not done, which for a Victorian gentleman was equivalent to a declaration of war. So they began mobilizing a fleet, sleek, modern steam-powered ships carrying cannons polished enough to see your reflection in. The British Navy had recently embraced industrialization. China, meanwhile, was still relying on ships that would have looked at home in the 1600s. You can imagine how this matchup went. Across the sea, the Daoguang Emperor was worried. Not worried enough to reform the military. Not worried enough to invest heavily in coastal defenses. But worried in the royal sense, pacing within the palace, looking anxious, issuing edicts that reassured no one. The emperor's court tried convincing themselves this was a temporary diplomatic annoyance. A misunderstanding. A matter of honor. Anything except what it really was, the beginning of an unavoidable, entirely lopsided conflict. Lin Zexe, meanwhile, continued enforcing his anti-opium measures with the determination of a man who believed righteousness alone could repel cannon fire. He wrote earnest memorials to the throne describing British traitors as barbarian troublemakers. And the emperor, reassured by these reports, allowed himself a small breath of relief, the kind rulers take right before everything collapses. Meanwhile, British ships approached the Pearl River Delta, their engines humming softly through the mist. The sailors on board likely felt extremely confident, aware that their weapons were decades ahead of anything they'd encounter. It's always easy to be brave when your cannons can fire twice as far as the other side's. What followed was not a dramatic, sweeping conflict. It was more like a slow unraveling, a series of skirmishes, misunderstandings, diplomatic fumbling, and moments where the Qing military revealed it was even less prepared than anyone feared. The first clashes were almost gentle, in the sense that both sides still believed the other might back down. Chinese commanders inflated reports, claiming victories that never happened. British captains were irritated that negotiations weren't moving faster. Messages drifted back and forth, each one politely failing to solve anything. And while the two empires exchanged letters, their ships quietly drifted into combat range. One of the earliest confrontations took place at the Kowloon estuary. The British fired a few warning shots. The Chinese forts responded with enthusiasm but little accuracy. Their cannons boomed impressively, but the cannonballs tended to fall short, wide, or occasionally backwards. British officers must have stared at this with a mixture of pity and discomfort, like watching someone attempt a difficult dance routine on a slippery floor. When the British returned fire, the results were immediate. Qing guns exploded from recoil. Fort walls crumbled. Soldiers scattered in confusion. And officers wrote reports explaining that the wind was unfavorable, because bureaucracies in every era have a remarkable talent for blaming the weather. The technological gap was painfully clear. Britain had iron-hulled steamships. China relied on traditional wooden junks. British artillery was precise, powerful, and designed with industrial efficiency. Chinese cannons were older, often rusted, and occasionally decorated more beautifully than they functioned. In a different context, this might have been charming. In a war, less so. And so, battle by battle, skirmish by skirmish, the truth became unavoidable: China was not equipped to face a modern navy. But the Qing court struggled to accept this, insisting that moral superiority should count for something. It didn't. By early 1840, British forces blockaded the coast, cutting off vital trade routes. They seized islands, shelled forts, and moved with deliberate, almost bored precision. Back in Beijing, ministers panicked more quietly. The emperor requested new strategies from his advisors. The advisors recommended things that sounded strategic but mostly weren't. And the war dragged on. Lin Zexu himself fell out of imperial favor. Not because he had failed morally, the emperor still admired his dedication, but because it was easier to blame him than confront the empire's military weaknesses. Lin was dismissed, exiled, and sent to distant Xinjiang, which imperial officials traditionally used for "we respect you, but please go away now" assignments. You can imagine him traveling westward, exhausted, wondering why doing the right thing had become such an inconvenient life choice. In his place, the emperor appointed officials who promised diplomatic solutions. These men sent negotiators to meet with British commanders. The British listened politely, declined, and shifted their ships slightly closer to Beijing with the calm persistence of someone pushing a chess piece toward checkmate. Through all this, everyday people in coastal towns lived in quiet fear. Fishermen watched foreign steamships with bewilderment. Villagers heard cannon fire echoing across the water. Merchants closed shops, whispered rumors, and tried to avoid any conversation involving the phrase imperial competence. And still, the Qing court hesitated. They attempted half measures, minor reforms, and committees. Always committees. Nothing reassures an empire in crisis like forming a committee to discuss the crisis. Meanwhile, the British seized the city of Ningbo with such ease that foreign observers compared the Qing defenses to wet parchment. After taking a city, British troops often found warehouses filled with opium pipes, silk, tax records, and occasionally, panicked officials who had attempted to hide behind boxes. At one point, British negotiators even proposed a treaty that would have ended the war quickly. But Qing officials refused, certain they could still win. Or perhaps certain that the emperor would be upset if they didn't pretend they could win. One official allegedly argued that China had inexhaustible manpower. This is true, but manpower loses much of its charm when armed with spears facing ships with cannons. Eventually, Britain advanced into the Yangtze River, cutting deep into the empire's interior. They reached Nanjing, one of the great cultural centers of China, without encountering meaningful resistance. At this point, even the most optimistic Qing advisors had to acknowledge the obvious: the war was lost. Not in a dramatic, sudden catastrophe, but in a slow, steady, thoroughly embarrassing decline. And so, in August 1842, China agreed to negotiate. The result was the Treaty of Nanjing, the first of the so-called unequal treaties. Britain demanded money, ports, favorable trading terms, and a small rocky island called Hong Kong, which no one in Beijing thought was especially valuable. This proved, in hindsight, to be a rather large miscalculation. The treaty was harsh. It opened China's ports to trade. It forced the empire to pay huge reparations. It granted Britain special privileges. But perhaps the most painful loss was psychological. For the first time, China had been defeated decisively by a Western power. And not just defeated, outgunned, outmaneuvered, and forced into humiliating concessions. You can imagine the Daoguang emperor reading the treaty, his hands trembling slightly. He had inherited a stable empire. Now he ruled one that had been cracked open. He blamed corrupt officials. He blamed foreign schemers. He blamed heaven. He blamed fate. He blamed almost everything except the fundamental truth: the Qing Dynasty had drifted into a war it was utterly unprepared to fight. The British returned home satisfied, congratulating themselves on a well-executed campaign. Newspapers praised the Navy. Merchants celebrated the new trade opportunities. And opium flowed back into China with greater force than ever. Irony can be cruel. The war fought because China tried to stop opium ended with opium becoming virtually unstoppable. So as Part 3 settles quietly to a close, consider this strange, slow-motion disaster. A morally righteous crackdown. A furious foreign empire. A mismatched war. And the kind of treaty that left scars lasting more than a century. If you had been in the emperor's court at that moment, what advice would you have given? Would you have pushed harder for reform? Or simply hoped the storm would pass? Let me know softly in the comments if you're still awake. And so, we continue our wandering through the long corridors of time, where the ordinary details of forgotten lives continue to glow faintly, like candle flames protected behind old glass. There is something soothing, almost meditative, in the way these small pieces of the past remain undisturbed. They ask nothing from us, only that we slow down long enough to notice them. When we last drifted away, we were speaking about those unremarkable days that once filled entire centuries. Days so simple, so uneventful, that they have all but dissolved in the historical record, except for fragments. And it is to those fragments we return now. A world without urgency. Consider, for a moment, how different time must have felt to people living centuries ago. They did not rush through life in the way we do today. There were no flashing screens, no buzzing notifications, no clocks that demanded to be watched. Their days followed patterns set not by schedules, but by sunlight. The morning began when the first rays entered through a window or slipped across the floorboards. Work began not at a fixed hour, but when it simply seemed time to begin. Evenings ended not when an alarm told them, but when darkness filled the room and eyes grew tired. Most of these days weren't filled with grand events. They were consumed by small, repetitive tasks: baking bread, mending tools, sweeping dirt floors, tending small fires, feeding animals, repairing roofs. These were the actions that quietly sustained life, unnoticed and uncelebrated. In truth, the majority of human existence has been made of such days. And yet, when we imagine history, we often picture climactic moments, wars, inventions, revolutions. But those make up only the thinnest sliver of the human timeline. Behind every recorded event are countless unnamed people moving through slow, simple routines. There is comfort in remembering that, because it suggests that even the most ordinary life is part of a much bigger story. The fading of footprints. Walk with me now into a small village somewhere in medieval Europe, its exact location long forgotten. The year is unimportant. It could be the 1200s, or the early 1400s, or any era in between. The world changes slowly here. The wind still moves the grass in the same direction it always has. If we stand very quietly in the center of the village, we might notice the way time sits heavily on every surface. The timbers of the houses are worn smooth. The paths between them carry grooves left by generations of footsteps. And yet, we do not know their names. Not a single villager here, who lived, worked, and died, is recorded in any book. And still, their world existed. Their laughter existed. Their worries, their hopes, their tiny victories, all of them were real. It is strange, in a way, how history erases nearly everyone. But perhaps that is why these tiny details feel so peaceful. Because they remind us that history is not just the story of the powerful, it is the story of everyone, even those who left no trace. The rhythm of forgotten lives. Imagine a woman living in a small timber house at the edge of the village. Each morning she steps outside to fetch water from the communal well. She wears a simple wool dress, patched several times at the hem. Her hands bear the faint scratches of daily work. She does not think of herself as a historical figure. She cannot imagine that centuries later, her life will be conjured only as a passing example in a late-night monologue. She simply lives. And in the living, she becomes part of something ancient. Her day passes quietly. She kneads dough, shapes it into loaves, warms them near the fire. The smell fills the room. Outside, a neighbor calls to her, asking whether she can help patch a torn cloak. Later, she visits the market where a merchant displays faded dyed cloths, each square a reminder of distant places she will never see. Nothing monumental happens. And yet, these are the days that shaped humanity. Because while kings plotted and armies marched, the vast majority of people carried on with lives that were humble, repetitive, and deeply human. Slow afternoons in the ancient world. Let us leave the medieval village for a moment and drift even further back in time, to ancient Mesopotamia. Another world of ordinary people, performing ordinary tasks. Picture a scribe sitting in a shaded courtyard, tablet in hand. Clay still cool from the morning. His reed stylus presses tiny marks into the surface, careful, deliberate impressions that will harden into permanence. He does not write poetry or grand political decrees. Instead, he inscribes lists of grain shipments or livestock counts. And yet, because clay preserves so well, his handwriting may survive longer than the stone walls around him. His name might not be recorded anywhere, but his small, routine responsibilities have lasted thousands of years. He pauses between lines, not because he is tired, but because a warm breeze passes through the courtyard, lifting small dust swirls across the ground. He watches them for a moment before returning to his task. In this tiny pause, a moment older than all modern nations, we find the gentle continuity of human life. Quiet craftsmen and silent workshops. Shift again, this time into a Roman workshop. A potter sits at his wheel. The room smells faintly of clay, damp earth, and soot from a nearby kiln. His hands move with practiced ease. The wheel spins. A vessel takes shape. Not a masterpiece. Just another cup, another bowl, another small container that will sit in someone's home and hold olive oil or grain. When we look at museum artifacts today, we marvel at how ancient they are. But the potter did not make them to be admired centuries later. He made them because someone needed them. Because it was his trade. Because it was his way of living. The sound in the workshop is soft, the turning of the wheel, the occasional crack of a drying pot, the muffled chatter of other craftsmen. Nothing about the moment demands attention. And yet, this is precisely what makes it soothing, its ordinariness, its simplicity. The long pause between great events. History often feels like a sequence of major moments. But in truth, the world spends far more time waiting than acting. Empires grow slowly, decline slowly, and collapse even more slowly. Entire generations are born into quiet transitional periods, unaware they are living through chapters that future historians will summarize in a sentence. Take, for instance, the years between major wars. Or the long stretches of peace where fields were harvested, children grew, and marketplaces filled with predictable chatter. These peaceful, uneventful times are barely mentioned in history books, and yet they consumed more of the human experience than any battle ever did. Imagine a 17th century farmer standing in his field at dusk. The sky slowly dims into a soft gray. He listens to the distant chirping of insects and the gentle rustle of crops in the wind. His tools rest beside him. Another day of work is done. He does not know that the century will later be remembered for scientific revolutions, global expansions, and political movements. All he knows is that tomorrow he must rise early, as he always does, to tend the land again. The beauty of repetition. There is something calming about repetition, about actions performed generation after generation until they become deeply rooted in the human soul. Grinding grain. Collecting firewood. Folding clothes. Fishing. Sewing. Stirring simmering pots. Sweeping floors. We often romanticize the past, but what comforts us is not the grand events, it is the stillness, the predictability, the slowness. People spend hours doing tasks that today take minutes. And in those long hours, they found space for their minds to wander, to settle, to breathe. A woman spinning wool in a small stone cottage might hum softly to herself, the rhythm of the wheel steady and hypnotic. A shepherd walking behind his flock might follow the same path his father and grandfather took, listening to nothing but the sound of the sheep's hooves. A monk copying manuscripts might spend an entire afternoon on 3 lines of text. Life unfolded not in rushes, but in gentle waves. The silence of lost voices. Sometimes I like to imagine all the people whose lives were never recorded, the millions upon millions who walked across the world leaving only faint traces behind. Not the rulers, not the generals, not the poets or prophets. But the quiet ones. The ones who carried water, tended fires, cooked meals, harvested crops, repaired roofs, raised children, and grew old without their names ever being written down. And yet, they shaped the world just as surely as those whose names fill history books. There is peace in remembering them. Because to remember them is to acknowledge that ordinary life is not meaningless. It is, in fact, the foundation of everything. Wandering into forgotten evenings. Picture now an evening in the 18th century. The sun has set. A family gathers around a small wooden table illuminated by a single candle. The flame flickers gently, casting silhouettes on the walls. They are not discussing great philosophical ideas or political movements. They talk instead about the weather, about the harvest, about who borrowed whose tools. A child plays idly with a carved wooden toy. Someone yawns. Someone else stirs a pot hanging over glowing embers. The world outside is quiet. Horses are settled in their stalls. Dogs curl up near doorways. Windows glow dimly in the village. And above everything, the sky stretches wide and dark, dotted with stars the family hasn't named and never will. Nothing noteworthy happens in this moment. But for those living it, this is life. This is what they will remember. A peaceful evening. A warm meal. Familiar voices. These things do not make it into historical records, but they shape what it means to be human. The soft weight of time. As we drift deeper into this quiet exploration of the past, it becomes easier to understand why so many ancient writings speak of time as a river. It does not surge forward in dramatic bursts. It moves slowly, steadily, smoothing everything it touches. Think of all the small joys that once filled forgotten days. A farmer tasting the first ripe fruit of the season. A child discovering a shiny pebble near a stream. A merchant unrolling a new bolt of fabric. A shepherd carving a simple flute on a hillside. A baker pulling warm bread from a clay oven. None of these moments altered the course of history. Yet each one was precious to someone. And somewhere, the traces of those emotions linger, carried quietly across centuries. The gentle ending of another day. Let us return once more to that quiet village, where the light is fading and lanterns glow softly through small windows. Inside one of the houses, an elderly man sits in a wooden chair near the hearth. He has lived his entire life in the same valley, walking the same paths, knowing the same neighbors. His memories stretch back through seasons of drought and seasons of plenty. He remembers helping his father plow fields. He remembers dancing at a harvest festival. He remembers the way his wife laughed when they were young. He remembers the smell of wet earth after rain. His life has not been extraordinary by the standards of history. But it has been full of moments, full of routines, full of quiet joys. He closes his eyes now, listening to the soft crackling of the fire. This is not a historic moment. It is something gentler. Something deeper. Something beautifully human. And this is where the comfort of history lies, not in its grand events, but in the quiet lives that fill the empty spaces between them. As our quiet journey through the forgotten rhythms of the past continues, we now move into another gentle chapter, one filled not with noise or upheaval, but with the peaceful subtleties of everyday humanity. These are the soft moments that history rarely bothers to record, yet they form the true foundation of the human story. We have walked through silent villages, ancient workshops, and long-faded evenings. Now, let us wander deeper still, into the overlooked corners of the world where ordinary people shape their days with careful hands and unhurried hearts. Tonight, we continue honoring those moments. The quiet crafts of ordinary hands. Imagine a town somewhere in the late Middle Ages, a place neither prosperous nor poor, simply typical. Its people go about their business with comfortable familiarity. In one corner of the town, a small carpenter's workshop sits open to the cobbled street. The morning light falls softly on the wood shavings scattered across the floor. Inside, a carpenter leans over a new piece of oak. He shapes it slowly, scraping his tool across the grain with careful, practiced movements. Every stroke produces a faint, comforting rasp. In moments like these, time seems to pause. He is not making something grand. Not a throne, not a cathedral door. He is crafting a simple chair. One of many he will make in his lifetime. But consider how much life that chair might witness. How many conversations it might overhear. How many quiet evenings it might support. How many children might climb onto it with muddy shoes and cheerful mischief. The carpenter does not think about these things. He focuses only on smoothing the edges, fitting the joints, shaping the legs so they stand evenly. And in this quiet attention, in this slow, devoted work, we see the gentle heart of human craft. Moments that drift away like smoke. When we think of the medieval world, we often picture bustling markets or armored knights. But the real medieval day was much simpler. Picture a baker waking long before dawn. The world outside is dark and still. His bakery, warmed by embers left from the previous day, smells faintly of yeast and wood smoke. He moves without hurry, mixing flour and water, kneading it into dough, pressing it into rough rounds. While he works, he hums softly to himself a tune he heard as a child and never forgot. He does not know that centuries later, someone will imagine this moment. He does not know that his quiet routine will become a soothing scene in a late-night monologue. He simply does what needs to be done. Outside, the first hint of dawn touches the sky. The village sleeps on. And inside the bakery, the bread rises slowly, as if waking with the world. This is history. Not the kind of history that appears in books, but the kind that fills the spaces between chapters. The weight of a single hour. Let us drift again, lightly, into another time and another place. Imagine a snowy winter morning in the 1600s. A small cottage sits at the edge of a forest. Inside, a woman wraps herself in a wool shawl and kneels to light the hearth. Her breath forms a faint mist as she blows on the kindling. Slowly, a flame catches, filling the room with soft warmth. She sits back on her heels, watching the fire grow. Outside the window, snow falls in large, lazy flakes, settling peacefully onto branches and rooftops. For a brief moment, she does nothing but breathe. There is no urgency in her day, not because her life is easy, but because speed was simply not part of it. Tasks will unfold when they unfold. The fire will warm the house when it is ready. Food will cook when it cooks. There is something beautiful in this acceptance. Something calming. We often rush from moment to moment, but people of the past lived inside each hour fully. They had no choice. Their world demanded patience. And so their days were filled with hundreds of small pauses, moments like this one, where someone simply watched a fire grow and felt the quietness of the world around them. The slow travel of old worlds. Today, we travel quickly. Cars, trains, planes, they shorten distances, compress time, blur the spaces between destinations. But once, travel was slow. Gentle. Predictable in its unpredictability. Imagine a traveler walking along a dirt road in the 11th century. He carries a bundle on his shoulder. His steps are steady, unhurried. The road stretches long before him, winding through fields and forests. Birds chirp overhead, the distant sound of a river murmurs faintly through the trees. He knows he will not reach the next village until evening. And that is fine. The journey itself is the day. He stops occasionally to rest beneath a tree or sip water from a leather flask. At one point he meets another traveler, a farmer returning from a distant market. They exchange greetings, speak for a few minutes about grain prices or weather patterns, then continue on their separate ways. Such meetings, brief and simple, shape the world in ways we hardly think about. Information traveled like this, slowly, person to person, voice to voice. No messages. No maps glowing on screens. Just footsteps and conversations that drifted across landscapes. The deep silence of night before electricity. One of the most profound differences between our world and the past is simply this: darkness. Before electricity, night was not a gentle dimming. It was a near-total blackout. Once the sun set, the world became a land of shadows and faint lanterns. Imagine a village at night in the early 1700s. The houses glow faintly from within, small windows leaking warm light. Outside, the air is still and cool. The only sounds are distant dogs barking or the soft hoot of an owl. People sit indoors, speaking quietly or simply listening to the crackle of their hearth. They have no screens to distract them, no lamps to push the night away. Their evenings are slow and deep. In this darkness, people think differently. They breathe differently. Time feels heavier, thicker, more settled. A child curls up with a blanket on a wooden bench. An elderly couple shares a cup of warm broth. A young man carves a piece of wood into a small figurine. Their world ends at the edge of the candlelight, and beyond that lies the great unknown of the night. And yet, they are at peace, because this is the rhythm they know. The small joys that filled ancient days. Even in the simplest lives, small joys shone brightly. In ancient Japan, a child might chase fireflies at dusk, cupping them gently in both hands and watching their glow seep through fingers like magic. In ancient Greece, elders might gather in a courtyard, sipping watered wine, exchanging small stories, each told more for comfort than for impact. In rural India centuries ago, women might gather by a well, filling clay pots with water while sharing laughter about something trivial that happened earlier in the day. In the Andes, shepherds might sit on a hillside at sunset, playing simple tunes on small flutes while watching their alpacas graze peacefully. None of these moments changed the course of civilization. But they made life worth living. The calm of manual work. There is a certain peace found in physical labor, the calming repetition of tasks performed with the hands. Before machines, people lived in this rhythm daily. A fisherman mended nets with slow, methodical movements. A farmer sharpened his scythe while humming softly. A woman ground grain between stones, steady and patient. A blacksmith hammered metal with deep, resonant strikes. These actions created a natural meditation. They were not distractions from life, they were life. People worked in tune with the land, the seasons, the rising and setting sun. In this, they carried a connection to nature we often lose in the modern world. Drifting toward another forgotten story. Let's wander now into a small monastery perched on a hillside in the 9th century. Inside its quiet walls, monks move with gentle purpose. The sound of footsteps on stone echoes softly through the corridors. In a scriptorium lit by narrow windows, a monk sits bent over a parchment. He is copying an old text, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a poem, perhaps a record of an event long ago. His quill moves slowly, dipping into ink, forming letters with careful precision. The hours slip by unnoticed. Outside, the wind rustles through trees. Birds glide lazily across the sky. But inside the monastery, time feels still. When the bell rings for midday prayers, the monk sets down his quill. He stretches his hands, stiff from holding the pen. His work will continue later, and perhaps tomorrow, and perhaps the next day. He has no deadline. Only devotion. His gentle routine is a reminder that not everything must be rushed, that some tasks are meant to unfold one steady stroke at a time. A world held together by simple routines. Throughout history, it was not grand achievements that sustained civilizations, it was routines. Countless small actions repeated daily. Drawing water. Tending gardens. Tying knots. Preparing meals. Lighting lamps. Folding cloth. Carrying baskets. Minding animals. These tasks may seem simple, but they were the heartbeat of life. A family would not survive without them. A village would fall apart without them. An empire would collapse if its people stopped performing the million small duties that held it together. This is the beauty of ordinary life, it is both humble and essential. The warm stillness of shared humanity. As we drift toward the end of this section, take a moment to imagine all the evenings that have passed in human history. All the fires that have burned low. All the quiet conversations. All the forgotten stories exchanged softly before sleep. These moments are not recorded anywhere. They did not shake kingdoms or transform nations. But they united people in a shared, ancient experience, the feeling of another day ending, of loved ones gathered nearby, of the soothing calm that settles over a household when night deepens. This is the essence of history. Not the noise. Not the battles. Not the kings. But the stillness. The warmth. The humanity. The millions of gentle, unremarkable moments that carried our ancestors through their days. Moments just like this one, peaceful, steady, soft as a breath. Let's drift a little farther tonight, easing deeper into the quiet corners of history where the world moved slowly, thoughtfully, and with a kind of unintentional grace. The past may have been difficult in many ways, yet inside its hardships we find moments of surprising gentleness, the small things people did simply to keep life bearable, meaningful, or just a little more comfortable. Imagine the world centuries ago, long before engines or screens or anything that hummed electronically. Days unfolded like long, steady breaths. People worked with their hands not because it made them virtuous, but because it was the only way to make anything at all. And through that simple necessity, they wrapped their routines with a certain calmness, a rhythm that still lingers in the imagination. The humble morning of a shepherd. Picture a hillside somewhere in the rolling countryside of medieval Europe. Dawn is just beginning, not a dramatic sunrise, but a dim silver light that stretches slowly across the grass. A shepherd steps out of a small stone hut, his cloak wrapped around his shoulders, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. His sheep graze nearby, quiet and drowsy. They lift their heads occasionally, more curious than alarmed. The shepherd carries a staff, not because he expects danger, but because it feels natural in his hand, an extension of himself, polished by years of use. He walks slowly among the flock, checking each animal with a patient eye. Nothing remarkable happens. Nothing exciting. A sheep coughs lightly. Another flicks its ears at a fly. The shepherd hums a soft tune he's hummed for years, one he doesn't even remember learning. These mornings shape the world far more than battles or kings. Millions of quiet dawns, millions of simple tasks performed without recognition. The shepherd does not think of legacy or history. He thinks only of guiding his flock to a patch of grass warmed by the early sun. There is comfort in that simplicity. A reminder that life once unfolded in gentle spirals rather than sharp turns. The slow art of traditional weaving. Let's wander to another time, another landscape, a small village somewhere in the distant mountains of Central Asia. Inside a modest home, a woman sits before a wooden loom. Morning light falls through the open doorway, creating long stripes across the floor. Dust motes float lazily, like tiny drifting stars. She pulls the shuttle through the threads, one careful pass, then another. The gentle rhythm of weaving fills the room, a soft clack, a sliding whisper, a settling of fabric. She has done this every day for years. Her mother did it. Her grandmother did it. The cloth she creates is more than a textile, it is a continuation of memory. The colors she uses come from natural dyes, deep reds from crushed roots, soft yellows from dried flowers, faded blues from minerals pounded into powder. They are not perfectly consistent, but that inconsistency gives the cloth warmth. Authenticity. Humanity. A child sits nearby, trying to imitate her movements with 2 sticks and a tangled ball of yarn. The woman glances over occasionally, her expression quiet but amused. She never scolds. The child will learn at their own pace, just as she once did. It is a small, ordinary scene. But there is something grounding about it, the slow process, the patience, the quiet passing of tradition. Threads weaving threads, binding generations together. Stone pathways and wandering merchants. Now let's drift into a bustling trade road, though bustling is perhaps too strong a word. The world before modern trade was slow even on its busiest days. Imagine a merchant traveling with a small wooden cart pulled by a sturdy donkey. The road beneath him is uneven, made of packed earth or scattered stones. His progress is steady but never hurried. With each mile, he listens to the creak of wheels, the soft clop of hooves, and the occasional irritated bray from his companion, who clearly feels he's carrying more than his fair share of responsibility. The merchant smiles at this. He has long since accepted that donkeys complain as a matter of principle. He passes villages, fields, and quiet streams. Sometimes he meets other travelers, a farmer leading a cow, a monk carrying a satchel of old manuscripts, a young woman bringing fruit to a distant market. They exchange greetings and small bits of news. Not important news. Mostly about weather, harvests, and rumors about a neighbor's suspiciously wealthy chickens. These tiny exchanges kept communities connected long before letters or newspapers. Information traveled by foot, carried in the pockets of conversation. And because everything moved at the pace of walking, nothing overwhelmed the senses. Life expanded into long, gentle stretches of time. A quiet afternoon in an ancient library. Let's drift to a different scene, a monastery library in the 12th century. Stone walls rise around rows of wooden shelves. The air is cool and faintly scented with old parchment and beeswax. A librarian, dressed in a simple robe, moves slowly between the shelves. He carries a stack of manuscripts wrapped carefully in cloth. His steps are measured, gentle. He knows every inch of this room. Every volume. Every fragile binding that might crumble under careless fingers. He places the manuscripts on a reading table. A young novice sits nearby, dipping a quill into ink. He copies each line with the focus of someone who understands the weight of what he's preserving. He knows that if he makes a mistake, the entire page may need to be redone. But the atmosphere in the library is not tense. It is calming. The silence is deep and comforting, broken only by the faint scratching of quills and the occasional shuffling of parchment. Imagine how peaceful it must have felt isolated from the turbulence outside. A sanctuary of knowledge where time seemed to slow, not out of boredom, but out of reverence. The past may have been filled with hardships, but in these libraries, a quiet light always glowed. Evening meals in forgotten homes. As the sun begins its slow descent, imagine people gathering in homes of all sizes across the world. Let's visit a few, each with its own quiet charm. In a Viking longhouse, families sit on wooden benches near the fire, sharing a pot of simple stew. Smoke curls lazily around the rafters, and someone tells a short, understated story about a storm that almost ruined the fishing nets earlier that week. In a small farmhouse in the Italian countryside, a family eats bread and cheese at a wooden table worn smooth by generations of elbows. The meal is unremarkable, but everyone eats gratefully, savoring the familiarity of the evening. In a small Andean hut, potatoes roast on warm stones. A grandmother sits with her grandchildren, teaching them a lullaby in a language that survives mostly in songs and whispered bedtime stories. In each scene, people gather not because of ritual or tradition, but because the day has ended and night is coming. The light dims slowly. Voices soften. The world settles. Meals like these, humble and everyday, shaped more of human existence than any royal banquet or ceremonial feast. Nightfall before modern noise. As darkness spreads across the land, homes prepare for night in ways very different from ours. People light candles or oil lamps. Their small flames flicker on walls, stretching shadows into long, slender shapes. The night feels fuller, denser, more mysterious. No engines rumble in the distance. No glowing screens. No humming refrigerators. Just the deep stillness of a world that rests. Imagine lying on a straw mattress, wrapped in a wool blanket. Outside, the wind rustles faintly through trees. A dog barks once or twice. Somewhere far away, a river whispers over stones. These are the nighttime sounds that carried countless generations to sleep. Even the stars seemed brighter then, not because the universe was different, but because nothing drowned them out. To people of the past, night was not merely a time of rest, it was a companion. A familiar presence. A gentle boundary between today's worries and tomorrow's possibilities. Dreams in the old world. Sleep, too, was different. People drifted into it naturally, without trying to optimize it or track it or analyze it. They simply let themselves fall into the embrace of darkness. Some believed dreams carried messages. Some believed they were glimpses of other worlds. Others thought they were simply the mind wandering while the body rested. But whatever they believed, they let dreams come as they wished, soft, mysterious, untamed. Perhaps a monk dreamt of a hill he climbed as a child. Perhaps a farmer dreamt of next year's harvest. Perhaps a shepherd dreamed of nothing at all, simply peace. The world of dreams connected people across cultures long before language or writing could. A gentle ending to this part. As we drift toward the end of this sixth section, take a moment to imagine yourself somewhere in this quiet world, walking a slow road, warming your hands by a simple fire, listening to the silence of a night free from noise and hurry. History can be chaotic. But it is filled with softness too, if we look for it. Maybe that's why we revisit these scenes, because they remind us of a pace we sometimes forget is possible. And if you were living in this world, what quiet job would you have chosen? Shepherd? Weaver? Librarian? Merchant? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Hey everyone, let's ease ourselves back into the gently unraveling world of late Qing China. You can settle in, adjust your pillow, maybe take a slow breath. The story isn't going anywhere fast, and honestly neither did the Qing court at this point. Their pace was less marching toward reform and more politely strolling toward catastrophe while pretending it's all fine. But that's how history often works. Empires rarely explode, they simply sigh themselves into collapse, one unhelpful decision at a time. When we left off, the court was still swaying between half-hearted reform and very sincere confusion. The self-strengthening movement had improved a few things on paper, but the deeper strain, the one humming under everything, was still opium. Not just the drug itself, but the whole ecosystem that surrounded it, the unequal treaties, the economic dependence, the psychological exhaustion, and the collective sense that the dynasty had been somehow tricked into a very embarrassing arrangement but didn't know how to undo it. So, tonight, let's drift into the next soft layer of this story, how the empire, already fragile, began leaning a little too hard on the same Western powers it privately resented. It's one of history's more ironic relationships. The Qing were like a person trapped in a bad friendship with someone they secretly despised but absolutely needed to borrow money from. By the late 19th century, opium revenue had become such a large part of British India's economy that no one in London had any real intention of stopping it. The British government could posture about morality when convenient, but quietly, everyone knew the math. The Indian colonial budget was being held up partly by Chinese smokers. If Chinese demand somehow evaporated overnight, London would have to explain why several colonial departments had suddenly gone bankrupt. And no politician wants to explain anything, really, let alone colonial accounting. Meanwhile, inside China, the habit had wormed its way into nearly every class, every province, every social niche. Government clerks used it to steady their nerves. Officials used it to counter boredom, which tells you a lot about the daily energy level of Qing bureaucratic life. Merchants smoked during negotiations. Scholars smoked while composing poetry about the tragedies of their nation, tragedies they then took another pipe to forget about. Even soldiers were caught smoking in barracks, which explains the creative variety of excuses offered whenever actual military matters needed handling. But the rot wasn't only physical. It was psychological. The opium economy quietly shifted the empire's internal balance of power. Silver flowed outward, weakening the currency. Local authorities, deeply underpaid, became dependent on bribes from opium dealers and smugglers. The court, desperate for funds, increasingly borrowed from foreign banks, which meant foreign political influence seeped deeper into government decisions. And the people, well, the people were caught in the middle, as usual. Too tired to revolt, too poor to recover, and too aware that their leaders weren't exactly giving motivational speeches. If you ever want to imagine the tone of China at the time, picture a household where everyone knows things are bad, but no one wants to be the one to say it. So they just sit at the dinner table quietly, sipping tea, hoping someone else will bring up the financial problems. Except in this case, the household was an empire, and the financial problems were international and worsening. Let's drift a little deeper into the everyday reality of late Qing politics. The imperial court had developed a sort of selective hearing when it came to bad news. Reports would arrive from provinces about bandit groups, food shortages, outbreaks of violence, and increasingly, foreign advisors behaving like the actual landlords of entire regions. But somehow, in the Forbidden City, the phrase "we'll get to that" became a very comfortable policy stance. Something about ornate roofs and quiet gardens makes problems feel like they belong to someone else, somewhere else. Cixi, who still held the real power behind the scenes, understood the danger on some level. She wasn't foolish. But she was cautious, protective of tradition, and surrounded by officials who learned, very quickly, that she preferred news presented in calm, non-threatening formats. "Your Majesty, everything is mostly fine" became the bureaucratic equivalent of a lullaby. And so, a dynasty already weakened by opium drifted further into a state of gentle denial. Meanwhile, opium consumption wasn't slowing. Even when the court attempted half-hearted crackdowns, they were undermined from within. Local tax collectors didn't want opium gone, they needed the revenue. Merchants didn't want it gone, it was profitable. Smugglers didn't want it gone, obviously. And foreign traders, comfortably protected by the treaties, weren't about to shut down the most reliable commercial pipeline they had ever encountered. The military was perhaps the saddest case. A modern army requires discipline, morale, and clear command structures. Late Qing forces, by contrast, were a patchwork of regional groups, private militias, and ill-trained battalions whose loyalty to the central government was, let's call it, flexible. Some commanders preferred foreign training. Others preferred traditional methods. Some soldiers were enthusiastic about drills. Others politely suggested that drills interfered with their smoking breaks. And the dynasty, balancing these factions, couldn't push anyone too hard without risking a rebellion. Let's float now toward one of the more ironic parts of this era. The foreign powers, for all their confidence and arrogance, were also deeply confused by China. Western officials often wrote back to their governments complaining that nothing in China ever moved on schedule. Requests stalled for months. Negotiations drifted in circles. Promised reforms quietly evaporated. Foreign diplomats couldn't understand how an empire could be simultaneously vast, ancient, bureaucratically dense, and yet somehow unable to enforce half the policies it proclaimed. Of course, from the Chinese perspective, the foreigners were the problem. They were loud. They were demanding. They wanted things signed immediately. They insisted on bringing their own translators, which Chinese officials found rude. They talked endlessly about international law, as if that was a universally agreed upon thing instead of a Western invention. And they kept asking questions like, why isn't the treaty being followed, which made the Chinese side wonder whether they understood how the empire actually functioned. Into this mutual confusion drifted the one force that still held everything together: habit. The Qing kept its rituals. The bureaucracy kept its paperwork. The foreign powers kept their trade routes. And the opium pipes kept glowing quietly across thousands of miles. No one wanted to shake the system too hard. Everything was fragile. Everyone knew it. But acknowledging fragility requires a kind of courage the dynasty simply didn't have anymore. Let's drift a bit more into the human side. Imagine a typical mid-level Qing official in this era. He wakes up before dawn, because tradition requires it, but he's already exhausted because he stayed up late filling out paperwork for a superior who probably won't read it. He brews his tea, tries to maintain a posture of dignity, and then opens a stack of reports describing problems he cannot solve. Floods. Bandit activity. Local gentry refusing to pay taxes. Foreigners demanding compensation for something. Refugees moving through his jurisdiction. Soldiers needing pay. And somewhere in that list is usually the quiet phrase, opium dens increasing. He knows he's supposed to shut them down. He also knows shutting them down will produce chaos, anger, and about 12 different political enemies. So he sighs, rubs his temples, marks the report to be addressed, and reaches for the pipe he swore he would stop using. It's not that he wants to smoke. It's just that he doesn't know how else to survive another day. And as he inhales the fumes, the world softens just enough for him to pretend that the problems aren't his. Multiply that scene by 100,000 bureaucrats across a massive, overstretched empire, and you start to understand the quiet erosion happening from the inside. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. It was simply tired. Let's drift again to the foreign concessions, these strange, semi-colonial bubbles inside China where Western laws applied instead of Chinese ones. They were like little international theme parks, complete with cafes, brick buildings, and police forces who spoke no Chinese but were very confident about enforcing their own rules. To Chinese observers, these concessions were reminders of humiliation. To Westerners living there, they were convenient hubs of business and leisure. And opium, unsurprisingly, flowed right through them. British traders maintained warehouses filled with crates of opium stacked almost as high as the treaty moralizing they pretended to engage in. American traders, though involved on a smaller scale, enthusiastically supported the system whenever it suited them. French and German interests benefited indirectly through customs arrangements. Everyone had a slice of the pie, except China, which was more or less the table the pie was sitting on. What made all this particularly tragic was that many Chinese intellectuals understood the structural problem perfectly. They wrote essays pointing out that the drug trade wasn't merely a health crisis but a sovereignty crisis. They noted that the unequal treaties carved the empire into zones of influence, and opium was the Trojan horse that let foreign influence seep deeper with every shipment. But the court, fragmented and cautious, couldn't muster the political unity to confront the issue. As the century wound down, the dynasty tried again, tentatively, to ban opium. They issued decrees calling for moral purification. Officials publicly smashed pipes in symbolic gestures. Posters were printed urging citizens to choose health over addiction. But the decrees weren't backed by consistent enforcement. Some regions complied. Others didn't. Smugglers simply raised their prices. And British merchants, who had perfected the art of looking innocent while doing something very profitable, shrugged and kept selling. Let's gently drift forward to a moment that sums up this era's contradictions. The Chinese government finally decided to start growing its own opium domestically. Yes, after decades of trying to stop the drug, they concluded that the only way to compete with foreign imports was to produce a local version. The logic was simple: if slightly depressing, if people were going to smoke anyway, the revenue might as well stay in China. The move made economic sense but moral nonsense. Imagine trying to stop alcoholism by announcing that you'll produce your own alcohol responsibly. Naturally, this led to even more addiction, not less. Domestic opium flooded the countryside. Prices dropped. Usage increased. And the dynasty discovered, painfully, that it was now competing against itself. Foreign merchants were delighted. They framed this development as a sign that China had finally recognized the legitimacy of the opium market, which is a very diplomatic way of saying we have succeeded so thoroughly that even our opponents have joined the industry. The Qing court, meanwhile, pretended this wasn't happening. Officials delivered reports insisting that domestic production was temporary, which became one of those phrases governments always use when something is definitely permanent. Let's continue drifting, slowly, toward the turn of the century, when China's internal contradictions were stretched to their limit. The economy struggled under the combined weight of silver outflows, foreign control, and local corruption. The countryside simmered with tension. The intellectual class demanded modernization. The military demanded funding. And the court demanded calm, which was the one thing the situation couldn't provide. And always, in the background, opium kept burning in its pipes, a symbol of everything China wanted to escape but couldn't. We'll rest here for a moment, letting the smoke curl softly upward in your mind. Before we drift into the next part, think about something. If you were a Qing official in this era, exhausted, underpaid, overwhelmed, would you have had the strength to resist opium, or would you have reached for the pipe too? Let me know gently in the comments below.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Let's settle again into the dim, drifting world of a dynasty that kept hoping tomorrow might be easier, while tomorrow kept politely declining. The Qing Empire, by the late 19th century, was like a lantern whose flame still flickered but couldn't decide whether to stay on. Every breeze of foreign pressure, every draft of internal crisis, made the light tremble. And somewhere beneath all that, opium continued glowing quietly in tens of millions of bowls, guiding the empire gently downward like a lullaby nobody could stop humming. As we drift into this next part, picture China around the 1890s. The empire was still vast, still populated by hundreds of millions, still adorned with imperial rituals and examinations. But it was also resembling an overripe fruit, soft in the middle, bruised at the edges, and just waiting for the right pressure to split. One of those pressures was the foreign presence. Not just the British or Americans, though they were certainly there, but an entire international cast of powers who treated China less like a sovereign nation and more like a particularly large negotiation table. Germany wanted its slice. France wanted its slice. Russia wanted its slice, preferably the cold ones near Manchuria. Japan, recently modernized and newly confident, wanted its slice too, and unlike the Europeans, Japan lived close enough to actually understand the region. And all of them, in one way or another, floated through the opium economy like fish in an ocean that wasn't theirs but which they somehow believed they owned. The Qing court, still operating behind thick red walls and layers of ceremony, insisted on believing it had control. Officials sent letters demanding respect and proper etiquette. Diplomatic meetings were held with exquisite formality. Tea was served just so. Gifts were arranged in the correct traditional order. But ritual can only disguise reality for so long. The world outside the Forbidden City was moving faster than the dynasty could think. Let's drift gently to one of the strangest consequences of this period, the rise of foreign missionaries. These men and women arrived with stacks of Bibles, bags of medical supplies, and the serene confidence of people who had never been yelled at by a Qing official before. They built schools, clinics, churches, and little communities that often felt more Western than Chinese. And in many places, they also became magnets for local resentment simply because they were protected by the same unequal treaties that had permitted opium in the first place. Missionaries didn't always understand this connection. They thought they were spreading faith, education, and modernity. They didn't quite realize that to many locals, they were walking reminders that China couldn't even police its own borders, let alone control foreign religion. And so, tension simmered. Sometimes it boiled. What made this tension particularly sharp was that many Chinese villagers genuinely appreciated missionary medicine, orphan care, education. But appreciation doesn't erase humiliation. And humiliation, for decades, had been piling up like dust in forgotten corners of the dynasty. Let's shift softly now toward the local militia groups emerging across the countryside. They called themselves many names, Righteous and Harmonious Fists being the most well-known, and they were essentially neighborhood self-defense clubs with a side hobby of extreme nationalism. Many were inspired by martial arts, folk religion, and the belief that foreign influence was poisoning China's spirit, which, to be fair, wasn't an unreasonable metaphor considering the amount of literal poison, opium, being circulated. The foreign powers, oblivious or dismissive, brushed off these local groups as unimportant nuisances. But history has a habit of letting nuisances snowball when empires are inattentive. Now, let's float deeper into the social atmosphere of this moment. Rural China was sinking under economic strain. Floods devastated farmland. Taxes increased. Banditry grew. Refugees wandered from province to province. And while all this was happening, foreign merchants were building comfortable homes in treaty ports decorated with imported furniture, drinking imported liquor, and writing smug diary entries about the backwardness of the land they were profiting from. Imagine how that felt to the people walking past those homes. The simmering resentment, the humiliation, the memory of the Opium Wars, none of it had disappeared. It had simply been quiet, the kind of quiet you feel right before a summer storm. And opium, the great dulling agent of the empire, didn't erase anger. It only blurred it, softened it, and made it unpredictable. And so, as the 1890s closed, China sat like a bowl of warm water, still on the surface, hot underneath, and ready to tip. Let's drift slowly to the foreign railways, perhaps the best unintentional symbol of this era. The Western powers loved railroads. They saw them as modern, efficient, and profitable. China saw them as intrusive metal snakes running across sacred land, disturbing feng shui, and often being built without permission. Railways required land. Land required negotiations. Negotiations required treaties. And treaties required accepting foreign influence yet again. It was not a comforting process. Peasants complained that railways scared away protective spirits. Local gentry complained they disrupted burial grounds. The court complained they benefited foreigners more than the Chinese. And the foreigners complained, loudly, that China was ungrateful for the gift of modernization. Everyone was annoyed. Nothing was resolved. And while the arguments dragged on, more opium flowed into the countryside. Some of it was foreign. Much of it was domestic by this point, grown in fertile soil, harvested by farmers who desperately needed the cash, and sold in markets where addiction was already a way of life. Let's drift gently into the palace again, where Empress Dowager Cixi remained the reluctant center of this swirling storm. Her position was paradoxical. She wanted to preserve the dynasty. She also wanted to preserve traditional power structures. And those two desires increasingly contradicted each other. Reformers whispered that modernization was the only path forward. Conservatives whispered that reform was dangerous Western corruption. Cixi listened to both, nodded politely, and then usually chose whichever option caused the least argument that day. It was a governance style best described as strategic procrastination. Meanwhile, the emperor, Guangxu, was technically the ruler but practically a decorative accessory. He supported bold reforms, admired Western technology, and believed China could rise again if it embraced change. Unfortunately, he also lived in the shadow of Cixi, who occasionally allowed him to make decisions the way adults allow toddlers to choose which color cup they want. This power struggle led to a series of reforms, counter-reforms, and mild palace tension. Nothing too dramatic. Just the usual generational conflict mixed with quiet resentment and political helplessness. Meanwhile, across the countryside, resentment toward foreigners reached a low, humming pitch. Missionaries, merchants, soldiers, and diplomats all lived under the protection of treaties that exempted them from Chinese law. If a foreigner committed a crime, he couldn't be tried by local courts. If a missionary offended local customs, he was shielded by consular authority. It was, from the Chinese perspective, like having permanent guests who refused to follow any house rules. Into this environment rose the Boxer movement, not yet a full rebellion, but a growing whisper. Their beliefs were a blend of martial arts, spirit possession, anti-foreign anger, and the conviction that China's weakness came from allowing Western influence into its veins, spiritually, culturally, and literally through opium. Ironically, their criticism wasn't wrong. Opium had entered China as a foreign toxin. It had undermined the dynasty, and Western powers had forced its trade with military violence. The Boxers simply focused on the wrong targets, missionaries instead of merchants, railroads instead of treaties, but their frustration was a perfect echo of a wounded society. Let's drift a little further into the everyday life of a Chinese villager at this time. You wake up in a house that leaks during rainstorms, with fields suffering from unpredictable weather, taxes increasing, and bandit groups roaming nearby. You hear rumors about foreigners building strange machines, railways, telegraph lines, electrical grids. You're told these things will help China but mostly seem to help foreigners. You see new churches in towns where old temples once stood. You hear whispers that foreigners are cutting open corpses for medical experiments, which fuels fear even if it isn't true. And everywhere you go, opium dens glow softly in the night. It's not surprising that people searched for something to believe in, something that promised strength, protection, purpose. The Boxer movement offered that. It offered physical training, ritual chanting, collective identity, and the comforting promise that spirits would protect true patriots from bullets. A dramatic claim, yes, but in times of desperation, people cling to anything that makes fear feel manageable. Meanwhile, foreign diplomats were increasingly nervous. They sensed hostility rising but couldn't understand why. They wrote home complaining that the Chinese are ungrateful, a phrase that generally reveals more about the writer than the subject. They insisted that all they had done was open trade, modernize ports, build railways, and protect their citizens. They didn't quite grasp that the Chinese had never asked for any of those things. Let's drift now toward the economic pressure building inside the empire. Silver was still leaking outward. Domestic opium cultivation, instead of solving the problem, had weakened agriculture. Farmers grew poppy because it paid more than grain. And when too many farmers grow the same crop, the food supply weakens, famine risk grows, and everything becomes more fragile. Local officials, desperate for stable revenue, taxed poppy heavily. But taxing poppy discouraged farmers. And discouraging farmers pushed them toward banditry. And banditry required more soldiers to suppress it. And soldiers required pay. And the government didn't have enough money. So taxes increased. And poverty worsened. And back around the cycle went. This wasn't collapse. Not yet. But it was the kind of slow-motion weakening that makes collapse inevitable. Let's drift gently into the foreign perspective again. Western newspapers began publishing cartoons of China sliced into pieces, each labeled with a different nation's sphere of influence. One cartoon even showed European powers carving China like a roast, while the Qing official in the center watched helplessly. It was insulting, of course. But it was also symbolic of real policy discussions happening in European capitals. Colonization was on the table. Partitions were being debated. And everyone seemed to assume China was simply too weak to resist. All of this fed back into Chinese resentment. The Boxers gained followers. Anti-foreign sentiment hardened. And the Qing court, always slow to react, finally took notice. What the court didn't understand was that the resentment wasn't just about missionaries or railways. It wasn't about the presence of foreigners. It wasn't even strictly about religion or culture. It was about opium. The humiliation of being forced to accept the drug. The devastation it had caused. The memory of the wars. The unequal treaties that had legalized the trade. The concessions that had become footholds for foreign influence. The financial drain. The disrespect. The shame. The entire national mood had been shaped by that initial wound. The opium crisis wasn't just a drug problem. It was a political, economic, emotional trauma that never healed, and everything else was simply the scar tissue forming around it. Let's drift now to a quiet question for you. If you lived in a society where foreign powers forced a harmful substance on your people, hollowed out your economy, and carved out cities where you had no legal rights, would you stay calm, or would you feel that rising anger too? Let me know gently in the comments. We'll slide deeper into the consequences in Part 9. The slow ignition of the Boxer Rebellion, the court's indecision, and the empire's last attempts to stand. Hey everyone, let's settle back in. If you've been drifting in and out of consciousness, which is entirely acceptable for a video like this, don't worry. You haven't missed anything too intense. The Qing Empire is still in the slow, unhurried process of falling apart. Foreign powers are still acting surprised that anyone dislikes them, and opium is still quietly humming in the background like a bad habit the empire never kicked. We left off in that restless moment just before the Boxer Rebellion, a time when tensions were rising in rural China like steam inside a kettle. Not whistling yet. Just quietly gathering pressure, pretending nothing was wrong. So let's drift there now, slowly, as though we're floating just above the dusty roads of northern China in the late 1890s. Fields stretching toward the horizon, villages clustered together for safety, and rumors moving faster than any official decree ever could. The Boxer groups, informal at first, had grown into something larger. They weren't secret societies exactly, because everyone knew they existed. And they weren't official militias, because the government very much wished they did not exist. Instead, they were that strange category of local movement that appears when an empire is weakened, part martial arts club, part spiritual revival, part neighborhood defense squad, and part nationalism fueled by decades of humiliation. The Boxers believed, quite sincerely, that through ritual, training, and spiritual possession, they could become immune to bullets. It was a comforting belief, even if tragically untrue. But when people are cornered, desperation sometimes becomes hope's closest cousin. Let's float gently into one of their gatherings. The air filled with incense. The chanting rhythmic and hypnotic. Young men moving through slow, deliberate martial movements under the watch of their instructors. And in the center of it all, a sense of unity, purpose, and righteous fury wrapped in a spiritual blanket. They had an enemy to blame. Foreigners. Not specific foreigners, just foreignness itself. The railways that cut through sacred landscapes. The missionaries who built churches where ancestral altars once stood. The soldiers who marched through treaty ports with no fear of punishment. The merchants who still carried opium, though now more discreetly. But beneath all of that, the Boxers were reacting to something deeper, the slow erosion of dignity. China had been forced to open its ports, its markets, its laws, its internal economy. It had failed to stop opium. It had failed to win 2 wars. It had failed to negotiate fair treaties. And failure, when repeated for decades, creates bitterness that no dynasty can smooth away. Let's drift back toward Beijing for a moment, where the imperial court was watching all this unfold from behind thick vermilion walls. The court was divided, as usual. Reformers argued that the Boxers were dangerous, superstitious extremists. They warned that the movement could create chaos that foreigners would use as an excuse to intervene even more. And foreign intervention, as the Qing court had learned repeatedly, rarely ended well. Conservatives argued the opposite. They believed the Boxers represented a spontaneous surge of patriotism, a natural uprising of the people against foreign pressure, a useful counterweight to missionary presence. It didn't hurt that many conservatives resented Western influence too, even if they couldn't say so publicly. Caught in the middle was Empress Dowager Cixi, the master of strategic indecision. She saw potential in the Boxers, potential to harness their energy, redirect it, and use it to strengthen the dynasty. But she also saw risk. Great risk. And Cixi preferred to make decisions only after waiting long enough that reality made them for her. Meanwhile, foreign diplomats were becoming increasingly nervous. They could smell the tension in the air, but they interpreted it through a lens of confident denial. Many believed the Chinese were naturally passive, an assumption that history routinely punishes. Others believed the Qing government was secretly controlling the Boxers, which was giving the court more credit for coordination than it deserved. Let's drift gently into a rural village now. A missionary school sits at the edge of the road, its white walls standing out against the mud brick homes surrounding it. A few dozen children study inside, learning reading, basic arithmetic, religion. Outside the school, local farmers walk past, some curious, some indifferent, some uneasy. The missionary family running the place tries to be friendly, not always understanding why the villagers avoid them. And at night, whispers spread through the community. Whispers about poisoned wells, body snatching, and foreigners plotting dark rituals. Most of these rumors were untrue, but fear rarely requires accuracy. It only requires momentum. By the late 1890s, the Boxers' anger began focusing on these missionary compounds. Some missions were attacked. Some Christians, mostly Chinese converts, were threatened or harmed. It was terrifying, unpredictable, and terribly preventable, but nobody could slow it down. And as the unrest grew, the Qing court hesitated, observing like someone watching a pot boil over and thinking, well, maybe it'll stop on its own. Let's drift a little closer to the early spark points. In Shandong province, tensions were particularly high. Foreign railways were under construction there. Missionary activity was dense. Floods had destroyed farmland, leaving villagers hungry and desperate. Bandits roamed freely. Local officials were either corrupt, overwhelmed, or both. The Boxers found fertile ground here, not literally, but emotionally. They clashed with missionaries. They clashed with converts. They clashed with foreign workers. And with each clash, rumors spread like wildfire. Foreign newspapers wrote alarming headlines. Chinese memorials to the throne offered mixed advice. And Cixi waited, weighing possibilities like a gambler trying to decide whether to fold or risk everything. Let's drift slowly toward a fateful winter in 1899. It was then that the Boxers expanded dramatically. Their rituals grew more elaborate. Their anti-foreign slogans louder. Their movements more organized. Villagers flocked to them not because they hated foreigners, though many did, but because the Boxers offered something no one else could, hope packaged as strength. The Qing court, with its shallow coffers and exhausted armies, could not offer hope. Foreign missionaries offered religion, but not empowerment. The Boxers offered empowerment without structure, sometimes a dangerous combination, but an appealing one. The movement spread northward like a tide. By the time it reached the outskirts of Beijing, even conservative scholars at court began arguing that perhaps the dynasty should align with these energized young men. After all, they were targeting the same adversaries the government resented. Why not use them? This was the moment, silent, subtle, and incredibly consequential, when hesitation turned into tacit approval. Cixi allowed Boxer groups to operate near the capital. She permitted officials sympathetic to the movement to influence policy. She let the Boxers believe the court was on their side. And once they believed it, nothing could restrain them. Let's drift gently into Beijing in early 1900, where foreign diplomats were drinking imported wine in gated compounds while Chinese officials walked the palace corridors with increasing anxiety. The atmosphere was surreal, tense yet calm on the surface, like a lake covered in thin ice. Rumors of Boxer activity filtered into foreign legations. Reports of villagers attacking railways reached the capital. Telegraph lines were cut. Churches burned. Missionaries fled toward Beijing for safety. And still, the court hesitated. To the foreign powers, this looked like negligence. To the Qing court, it was strategy. Or at least, what they hoped was strategy. Let's wander through the minds of some Qing officials. Many believed, quite optimistically, that if the dynasty backed the Boxers, it could harness their energy to drive out foreign influence. They imagined a wave of patriotic strength sweeping through the empire, throwing back decades of humiliation. They conveniently ignored the fact that the Boxers were untrained, poorly coordinated, and physically incapable of resisting modern rifles. But inconvenient facts tend to be ignored when people are desperate. By the spring of 1900, Boxer activity had reached the capital. They marched into Beijing chanting anti-foreign slogans, performing spiritual rituals, and waving banners. The court did not disperse them. Instead, officials watched with a mixture of admiration, fear, and wishful thinking. Foreign diplomats panicked. They telegraphed home requesting military support. Troops began arriving from multiple nations, converging on Tianjin and the coast. The atmosphere turned brittle, as though the whole region was waiting for someone to say the wrong sentence and start a fire. And someone did. Let's drift gently into early June 1900. A German diplomat, Baron von Ketteler, believed the Chinese should respect foreign presence. This was a bold assumption, and he acted on it with a confidence that did not serve him well. While traveling through Beijing, he confronted a group of boxers. Words were exchanged. Shots were fired. And Baron von Ketteler was killed in the street. Foreign powers reacted with predictable outrage. Troops marched. Legations fortified themselves. The Eight-Nation Alliance mobilized. And suddenly, the dynasty's fragile diplomacy shattered. Inside the palace, Cixi finally faced the decision she had postponed for too long. Should she crush the Boxers to appease foreign nations? Or embrace the Boxers to defend China's pride? She chose the second option, a decision rooted in desperation and emotion more than strategy. She declared war on all foreign powers simultaneously. It was, historically speaking, not a wise choice. Declaring war on 8 industrialized nations while your own military was under-equipped and half-addicted to opium was the geopolitical equivalent of challenging a thunderstorm to a fistfight. But Cixi believed righteousness would prevail. And righteousness is, unfortunately, not a substitute for artillery. Thus began the Boxer Rebellion proper, not as a spontaneous uprising, but as an imperial gamble. The consequences were immediate. Foreign legations were besieged. Chinese Christians were targeted. Foreign armies marched inland. The Qing armies, though ordered to fight, were divided, confused, and far less enthusiastic than the Boxers marching beside them. Let's drift into the siege of the Foreign Legation Quarter, a strange, surreal moment where diplomats, missionaries, soldiers, families, and Chinese converts were trapped in a cluster of compounds, surrounded by Boxer mobs and Qing forces. Inside, food was rationed. Gardens were dug up to create makeshift farming plots. Ammunition was scarce. People lived with constant fear. But foreigners also documented everything, leaving behind detailed journals, sketches, and letters describing the event. Outside, the Boxers chanted, believing their rituals made them bulletproof. The Qing generals hesitated, unsure how aggressively to press the attack. And the dynasty watched from afar, hoping the impossible might happen. It did not. Foreign forces advanced from the coast. They had modern artillery, modern rifles, telegraph support, and military organization. The Chinese defenders, Boxers and imperial troops alike, stood no chance. The Eight-Nation Alliance reached Beijing in August 1900. Fighting erupted. The city fell. The palace was abandoned as Cixi fled in disguise, riding in a peasant cart, bouncing along dusty roads, contemplating the collapse she had hoped to prevent. Let's drift softly toward the aftermath, but we'll save that for the next part. Before we transition, let me ask gently, if you were sitting in the Forbidden City in 1900, watching foreign powers advance and Boxers chanting at the gates, would you have chosen differently? Share your thoughts softly in the comments. Let's drift a little farther now, moving deeper into the dimming twilight of the Qing court, where everyone insisted that nothing was wrong while almost everything was crumbling. It's a very human instinct, after all. When the roof is leaking, the walls are tilting, and the neighbors are politely relocating their valuables away from your house, you simply pour tea, straighten your robe, and pretend this is all part of the plan. The Qing officials, in this era, perfected that approach into an art form. You see, by the late 1850s, the empire had reached a sort of exhausted equilibrium, a delicate balancing act of denial. The opium flow continued, filtered through 1,000 creative channels. Bribes kept the trade smooth. Reports were quietly rewritten into softer, more palatable versions, all ending with the same reassuring phrase, "The situation is stable." Which meant, more accurately, we dearly hope no one visits and checks for themselves. Even the emperor drifted into a kind of passive melancholy, the sort that settles over rulers whose worlds are slipping away in slow motion. He knew the empire was ill. He could feel the weakness spreading through its limbs, the way every decision took far too long, like someone trying to walk through thick water. But he was surrounded by officials who assured him, day after day, that improvement was just around the corner. They said it with such calm conviction that he almost felt rude disagreeing. So he nodded. And so the empire continued. Meanwhile, opium addiction had taken root not only among commoners but among many officials, which made governing a bit like asking a room full of drowsy librarians to perform acrobatics. Some nodded off during meetings. Others made decisions with the dreamy confidence of people who believed everything would simply resolve itself. It didn't. But no one wanted to say that aloud. China's economy had become so dependent on imported opium that removing it would have required a complete restructuring of more than half the empire's informal financial networks. And restructuring, as you probably know, is not something old empires excel at. They prefer continuity, even if the continuity is harmful. Especially if changing course would require admitting mistakes. And so, the river of silver continued pouring out, and the river of poppy paste kept flowing in. Britain, naturally, saw this from a distance and recognized a useful opportunity. If China could be nudged into signing even more favorable agreements, then British merchants could enjoy profits that made government ministers smile contentedly into their evening port. So pressure increased. Diplomats arrived. More requests were made. And by requests, of course, we mean demands wrapped in polite phrasing and backed discreetly by gunboats. China resisted because it had to, not because it expected success. Each negotiation was a long, slow process ending with the same dispiriting conclusion. The empire was no longer capable of defending its own interests. The world had changed. China had not. And history is rarely gentle with civilizations that refuse to adapt. But the everyday people, meanwhile, continued living their lives, because they had no choice but to. Villages still planted rice. Market stalls still opened at dawn. Old men still argued over who brewed the best tea. The empire's collapse was so gradual, so slow, and so subtle that many citizens barely noticed. Empires don't always fall with a dramatic crash. Sometimes they simply exhale, release a long, tired sigh, and fade. The fields still shimmered under the afternoon light. Children still ran through dusty streets with the uncomplicated joy of youth. And yet, in the background, everything was gently deteriorating. Records left unfiled, roads unrepaired, taxes uncollected. A slow, spreading softening of the empire's bones. Occasionally, one clear-minded official would attempt to introduce reforms. They'd propose updating laws, strengthening local governance, curbing corruption, and reducing opium use. These proposals were usually met with warm compliments and polite applause before being quietly ignored. Reformers grew accustomed to smiling and pretending they were satisfied. Some eventually gave up and grew vegetables instead, a far more predictable pursuit. Still, the intellectual dissatisfaction of the era grew stronger. Scholars wrote poems comparing China to an aging dragon whose wings were heavy with sleep. Some blamed the foreign powers. Others blamed the court. Others blamed fate itself. But nearly all agreed on one thing. Opium had robbed China of its strength, not only in the physical sense but in the spiritual one. It had sapped willpower, ambition, and unity. A nation cannot defend itself if it cannot stay awake. Foreign merchants, meanwhile, enjoyed the bizarre spectacle of an empire that despised the opium trade yet relied on it for revenue and political lubrication. To them, this was a kind of grand cosmic irony. They wrote long, amused letters home describing the contradictions. Officials who condemned opium publicly then purchased some privately. Laws that banned the substance, yet were rarely enforced. A government that wanted to stand tall but could no longer lift its head. Opium dens sprouted in every major port city, dimly lit caves of drifting smoke and shadowed figures reclining in silence. These places had an eerie serenity to them, calm, slow, and dreamlike, like a world in which time itself had grown heavy. But behind that quiet was the steady heartbeat of decline. The empire was sliding, gently, steadily, and almost imperceptibly toward another crisis, one even larger than the last. A crisis that would come not from foreign cannons, but from within. A revolt simmered in the countryside. Secret societies whispered of change. And ordinary people, exhausted by corruption, taxation, and neglect, began imagining futures in which the Qing no longer ruled. But we'll drift into that in the next part, as the empire's inner tension begins to expand like a slow-growing crack in old porcelain. For now, we can simply settle into the calm before the next storm, a strange moment in Chinese history when the empire looked stable from afar but trembled quietly beneath the surface. And if you were a Qing official at the time, you might have poured another cup of tea, stared at the wall for a long minute, and wondered, not aloud of course, whether anyone else sensed it too. Before we wander onward, tell me in the comments, do you think the empire could have recovered if opium had been successfully removed? Or was the decline already inevitable? Let's drift gently into the final stretch of this long, drowsy journey through the twilight of the Qing Empire, where the last traces of smoke curled upward and faded into a sky that no longer belonged to the dynasty. By the early 20th century, the opium that had once seeped quietly through the empire had become only one thread in a much larger tapestry of decline, but it was the thread that had unraveled everything else. And by now, it hung loosely, like the final frayed fiber on an old imperial robe. The court, still clinging to old traditions, tried to restore some sense of dignity. There were proclamations, edicts, and campaigns declaring yet again that the empire was on the verge of revival. One had to admire their optimism, even if it resembled the hopeful confidence of someone putting a single bandage on a collapsing bridge. Officials repeated the familiar assurances. The nation was awakening, reforms were underway, the dynasty would endure. They said it with the calm determination of people who knew their words were supposed to mean something, even if no one believed them anymore. The young emperor, Puyi, became the symbolic center of these hopes. A child seated upon an ancient throne, expected somehow to reverse centuries of damage. He toddled through ornate halls, surrounded by adults who whispered reminders of former glory while the world outside transformed without waiting for him. He was bright, curious, and capable, but he was also 3. There are not many problems a toddler can fix, especially not an empire tangled in corruption, foreign intrusion, economic exhaustion, and the lingering shadow of opium. Inside the Forbidden City, life remained frozen in ritual. Every bell, every robe, every bow still followed the rhythms of a world that no longer existed. The court carried on with its ceremonies like a troupe performing a perfectly choreographed dance for an audience that had already left the theater. And outside those red walls, China's provinces simmered with frustration. Warlords carved territories. Reformers debated. Students marched. Merchants reorganized. And all of them, quietly or loudly, knew the dynasty's time was ending. You could almost imagine the empire as a great lantern in the evening, one that had burned brightly for centuries but whose flame was now flickering low, fed by far too little oil. And opium, ironically, had been both part of the flame and part of the reason for its fading. It had fed revenue systems, soothed officials, softened resistance, and drained the treasury. It had seeped into every layer of society until even removing it felt like tearing out the foundation of a house. And so, when the lantern finally dimmed, it happened gently, almost softly, with more sighs than shouts. When the Qing Dynasty finally fell in 1912, it wasn't the dramatic, fiery collapse that some might expect. Instead, it was a negotiation, a long exhale, an arrangement made on paper. The last emperor abdicated with more ceremony than anger, more resignation than rebellion. It was not the sort of ending that storytellers usually crave, but it was very human, and very tired. A monarchy that had ruled hundreds of millions simply acknowledged, at last, that it could rule no longer. In the years that followed, many tried to trace the exact moment when the decline became irreversible. Some pointed to the British merchants and their crates of opium. Some blamed the court's stubborn refusal to modernize. Others saw the Taiping Rebellion, or the crushing defeats in war, or the endless maze of corruption that choked the bureaucracy. But in truth, empires rarely fall for just one reason. They drift downward in slow spirals, tugged by dozens of small forces. And opium, subtle and devastating, had been one of the most persistent. It had altered the empire's economy, thinned its silver reserves, weakened its armies, and dulled the minds of those meant to defend it. It had made bribery easier, denial more comfortable, and decline more bearable. Sometimes, destructive forces don't roar. Sometimes, they whisper. And the Qing listened to that whisper for far too long. Yet, even in decline, life went on for millions of ordinary people. Farmers planted. Shopkeepers haggled. Scholars debated in tea-houses. The world didn't end, it simply changed direction. And perhaps that is the calming truth beneath all this. Empires rise and fall, but people adjust, rebuild, adapt. The Qing dynasty faded, but China continued, reshaping itself again and again, as it always had across thousands of years. As we settle into the final quiet moments of this story, you might feel a kind of gentle melancholy, not sharp or painful, but soft, like looking at an old painting with colors that have mellowed over time. The fall of the Qing wasn't just a political shift, it was the end of a long cultural rhythm. But endings, even sad ones, often carry a quiet beauty. They open space for something new, something different, something unexpected. So let your thoughts drift with that idea for a while. Imagine the empire's vast landscapes, forests, rivers, mountains, continuing on, untouched by bureaucratic collapse. Imagine families lighting lanterns at dusk, unaware of dynastic transitions. Imagine the slow, steady hum of everyday life outliving even the greatest empires. In the grand scale of things, human stories stretch farther than the rise or fall of any single dynasty. And now, as we gently close this final chapter, I'll ask you one last question to ponder or to answer softly in the comments if you're still awake. Do you think the Qing Dynasty could ever have survived if history had taken just a slightly different turn, or was its ending always written in the smoke? Take your time with that. Let it drift. And before we fully settle into silence, thank you for listening, for watching, or for dozing off somewhere around part 3, no judgment at all. If you enjoyed this calm journey through history's dim corridors, feel free to like the video, share it with someone who enjoys sleepy storytelling, and subscribe for more late-night wanderings through the past. Rest well, and I'll see you in the next quiet tale. Point 12.